Imagine that you and a friend are in a warehouse filled with boxes. You're on one side, she's on the other side, and she wants to get to this side, and you want to get to that side. Now let's add a bit more to it. Let's say that you have to remain on the ground, and she has to remain on top of the boxes. We've just added an element of depth to this game, because as you carve out the boxes to make your path, you're stacking boxes up that can be used for her path. This adds an element of strategy to the game. I called the prototype to this game Path, and I didn't give up on it because I really liked the premise, but it turned out under scrutiny that the game lacked complexity, and whoever had first move could easily win. So I moved it into a different direction. So far we have been thoroughly enjoying this game. It has a rather simple gameplay that turns out to be rich in complexity. And the more you start to think about this, the more you really start to fall in love with it. There's quite a bit here to explain, so I would prefer to take my time with it. So I'm going to break this into two parts. I'll make the first part about making this, and I'll make the second part about the gameplay itself. This is a hexagon. A hexagon has 6 sides. We're going to be making 37 of these. This is a 30, 60, 90 triangle. It's called that because its interior angles are 30, 60, and 90 degrees. Why I mention this is because these numbers will tend to turn up again and again when you're working with hexagons. You have to remember that the numbers that we use as designations, 30, 60, 90, are ultimately arbitrary. And you can really think of 30 and 60 as parts of a hexagon, just like you can think of 90 degrees as parts of a square. The hexagon has a really natural geometry, as illustrated by these spheres. They just kind of fall into place. Similarly, a hexagon can be found throughout the natural world. This is called a benzene ring, and if organic chemistry is your thing, you can learn all about it. Almost in spite of how common the arrangement seems to be, making something with hexagons proves to be quite picky, so this project will require a fairly high degree of accuracy and precision. Luckily, drawing a hexagon in a circle is one of the simpler geometric constructions. Personally, I think it's even easier to make than a square, because you don't even have to make any adjustments to your compass. This is convenient for us because we can draw our own 30, 60, 90 triangle by just connecting 3 of the hexagon's points. Anything worth making starts at the table saw. So I'm starting with some 5mm plywood, just like I used in that project. My target size is a finished hexagon that has about 1.5 inches from vertex to vertex. So in order to achieve this, I cut my material to around 1.29 inches. I didn't show it, but I've already applied a coat of polyurethane to both sides and the edges. And this should help to suppress some of that splintering that happens when you cut during the next few steps. I would like to point out that there is an easier alternative, but the process I'm going to show you turns flat stock like this plywood into hexagonal tiles, and it holds them to an extremely tight tolerance. The easier alternative is to just rip a 30-degree hexagonal stock and then cut slices. Before you choose which tile to go with, let me offer you a few considerations. One thing to think about is aesthetics, because if you make it out of plywood, it's a lot less distracting, whereas pieces made out of hexagonal stock have an end-grained pattern. The end-grained tiles are going to be considerably weaker as well. Another difference between these two tiles is how they slide across the tops of other tiles. Plywood tiles are extremely smooth. In comparison, 2x4 parts have a lot of friction between them. So, all things considered, if you're asking my opinion, I prefer the plywood tiles. This contraption is a dedicated sled, and it cuts 2 pieces at a time. So here's the stock, and here's the target shape. A bird's eye view of it gives away all of its geometry, and it's really just a bunch of the same angle over and over again. And as we dismantle it, it's easy to see that it's just a bunch of simpler parts. This can also come off in case I want to ever repurpose the sled, but I have it set to where I like it. Notice that the blade height is just high enough to free my parts. It doesn't need to be any higher than that, and this is important so that this part stops. The mild gap that you see here is actually deliberate, and that's so the cut is defined by this section, which is stationary, rather than the stock, which is free, and that just reduces the potential for binding. If all of this is starting to seem a bit intimidating, don't worry, there are alternatives to using a table saw. I'll discuss making a game board from sheets of craft foam later on in the video. The cutoffs are mostly little equilateral triangles, and they add up quickly. So I highly recommend coming up with a way to capture them. And who knows, maybe you can use them to make something. There's one final thing that I want to show you about making hexagons, and then you're on your own. Notice that this little jig is spring-loaded. And how this works is it holds a pile of these in place so that I can reduce deviation just a little bit. I'm just knocking off the tops of the high spots. I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm just looking for places that are a little too far away from average. The next part to concern ourselves with is this perimeter fence piece. And it's easy enough, it's just 3 half hexagons. Nevertheless, these templates will be available to you. The thickness of your stock for this part should be about 1.5 times whatever the thickness of your tiles is, and that's just so they don't fall off when they're on the upper layer. I think we can skip how to make this. It's been fairly well established by now. This doesn't have to be perfect, it only has to be close. These go here, It's oversized at the moment because we're going to cut it down. And we're going to let these little tiles dictate where the perimeter blocks go. I found that it's easier to do it that way than to try to make perfect parts from the beginning. It's all fitting together quite nicely on this one, and I have an extra 1/8 of an inch that allows me some play that I can cut off later. So I'm ready to glue these on, but first I want to standardize the gap all the way around. Alright, I'll do half at a time, which means that I'll come back in an hour and do the other 3. The hexagonal grid is very important to gameplay. It turns out to be extremely distracting if you don't have one. And the best way that we found to put it on is to use this pen and to do it before the oil. I forgot this time. And that brings us to craft foam. This is the same stuff that I used in this project, except not all of it is self-adhesive. This is, and if you sharpen a piece of pipe, you can use it as a hole cutter. These little glass pieces are easy enough to find at a craft store. They're often called glass gems, and putting a little foot on the bottom makes them very pleasant to use. I heated them up with a heat gun just to ensure adhesion. This game board is made entirely from craft foam. It's not so easy to make, but it's certainly possible, and it plays rather nicely. This was made from layers of 2mm and 6mm foam, and all of it was cut with an X-Acto knife. More on that in a bit. For fastening these together, I used a hot glue gun. They make a special glue for this, but I didn't have that. As for the template, you'll want to put rubber cement on the paper itself, and then press it to a piece of the craft foam. The hardest part is the cutting. Not so much because the cutting is difficult, but because it's hard to keep your knife perfectly square. The trick that I found for doing this is to use a straight edge to ride down these cuts, but don't go the whole way through. You just want to barely cut through the paper. Then, after you've made the initial cut that keeps it straight, the subsequent cuts you want to concentrate on keeping your knife square. So again, just to be clear, use a straight edge, make a shallow cut, then take your straight edge away, and finish your cuts by concentrating on keeping your knife square. When the pieces are all done, if you used rubber cement, the paper template should just peel away easily. The board itself is pretty stable because the base of it has 2 layers of the 6mm foam glued together, and so that makes it nice and solid. On top of that, there's 1 layer of the 2mm just for color, and then of course the perimeter walls, which are 6 and 2. Well, I think I've given you enough food for thought with respect to board design, so I think it's time for us to discuss gameplay. These 4 spaces are your base. These 4 spaces are the opponent's base. The object of the game is to get one of your pieces into the opponent's base. If you do it, you win. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, each color has to stay on their own path. In this case, black has to stay down on the game board, and white has to stay up on top. When it's your turn, you get 2 moves. Or you could think of it as each turn has 2 halves. One half is to move one of the tiles. The other half is to move one of your pieces. It doesn't really matter which order you take these moves in, but in the first case, the first move, you have to move a tile first, because you don't have any other options. Next, your opponent will make their 2 moves, first by moving any of the tiles on the board to anywhere else they want, and then by moving any of their pieces in any direction they want. In this case, let's say that it's black's turn. If black were to make this move, now 2 of the adjacent sides of this white piece are occupied by black pieces, and so this white piece is being threatened. Now that it's white's turn, white has to immediately retreat. If white doesn't, because white can't, then on the next turn, black can capture this piece. You're allowed to transport from side to side across the board in this game. In this case, black can move from here to here because transports are allowed while you're still at your home base. Likewise, this space and this space are actually adjacent. Because black could pass through here, if this space were at the right height, it can actually trap this piece by putting it under threat, having it surrounded here and here. There's one final major rule, and it's designed to keep you from defending your home row indefinitely. As soon as you move out of your home spaces, they become immediately vulnerable to attacks. So in this case, white could place a tile here on your home base. You are not allowed to remove it. You are not allowed to adjust any of the tiles on your home spaces. See if you can find the moment where my game starts to go completely wrong here. I know that I try to give a pretty straightforward and dry presentation. I try to keep it factual. But I have to admit, I'm really excited about this game. We have been totally enjoying it. And I think you'll have a lot of fun with it too if you give it a chance. So far we haven't found anything quite like this game out there. But if you do come across anything similar, let me know it in the comments, and that way I can give credit where it's due. Also, check the description for template links and the most recent rule sheets and any other additional information or updates that I'll post if I discover any problems that the two of us didn't find during gameplay testing. Well, again, I hope you really enjoyed this and found it interesting. So, until next time. I messed up so bad.